Pompeii did not die the way most people think. The city was not simply buried in ash and forgotten. It was a living, breathing, deeply complicated Roman town that had already survived earthquakes, political upheaval, and social violence before the volcano ever stirred. And the eruption itself, one of the most studied catastrophes in all of human history, unfolded over nearly 20 hours, in ways that gave thousands of people real choices, real chances, and in many cases, real failures of judgment. What does it mean that a city so vividly alive was erased in less than a single day? If you find that question compelling, please subscribe to our channel, like this video, and leave a comment below. It genuinely helps us keep producing serious, deeply researched history documentaries and helps more viewers find this work. What you are about to follow is not simply the story of a volcanic disaster. It is the story of a city that grew from a small Oscan settlement on a lava plain into one of the most commercially vibrant towns in the Roman world. You will watch it absorb Greek culture, bend under Roman conquest, explode in civic violence, and then rebuild itself into something extraordinary. You will see the hidden pressures that made the eruption so lethal, the decisions made in the hours after Vesuvius began to roar, and the long silence that followed. You will also see how Pompeii came back, not as a living city, but as something stranger and more powerful. A mirror that every generation since the 18th century has held up to itself. By the end, the question will not simply be what happened to Pompeii. It will be what Pompeii keeps telling us about the fragility of everything we build and the strange persistence of the human need to be remembered. To understand Pompeii, you have to begin not with Rome and not with Vesuvius, but with the land itself. The volcanic plain south of the Bay of Naples is among the most fertile ground in all of southern Italy. The soil there is deep, dark and rich with minerals deposited by centuries of volcanic activity. Rivers cut through it, the sea curves around it, and the climate is mild enough to grow grain, olives, and vines in abundance. This was not an accident of geography that people stumbled upon. It was a magnet. Wherever food grows easily and trade routes converge, people follow. The earliest secure evidence of human activity on the site of Pompeii goes back to around the 8th or 7th century before Common Era, when Oscan-speaking peoples settled the elevated lava spur above the Sarno River. The Oscans were an Italic people, related to but distinct from the Latins who would later dominate Italy. Their settlement was modest, probably a cluster of agricultural households taking advantage of the raised ground for defense and the river below for water and transport. Historians and researchers have found traces of this early occupation beneath the later Roman layers, though the evidence is fragmentary and the exact character of the settlement remains debated. What is clear is that Pompeii's position made it valuable almost from the beginning. The mouth of the Sarno River gave access to inland agricultural regions. The bay gave access to the sea routes that connected southern Italy to the wider Mediterranean world. Greek colonists had already established thriving settlements along this coastline, most notably at Cumae to the north, and at what would become Naples. The Greeks called the region Campania, a name that reflected its extraordinary productivity. The Oscans at Pompeii lived within reach of this Greek world, and were inevitably shaped by it. By the 6th century before Common Era, Pompeii was already showing signs of something more organized than a simple farming community. A sanctuary, likely dedicated to a deity associated with the land or fertility, was established in what would later become the triangular forum area. Greek architectural influence is visible in the earliest religious structures, suggesting that the Oscans were not merely passive neighbors of the Greek colonies, but active participants in a shared cultural zone. Trade goods from across the Mediterranean have been found in early Pompeian contexts. The town was plugged into wider networks even before it had anything like a formal civic identity. The 5th and 4th centuries before Common Era brought disruption. The Samnites, a powerful Oscan-speaking highland people from the interior of southern Italy, expanded their influence into Campania and eventually absorbed Pompeii into their sphere. This was not necessarily a violent conquest in every case. In some Campanian towns it was more a shift in political alignment. But the Samnite period left a deep mark on Pompeii. The urban grid that would define the city's layout for centuries took clearer shape during this era. The street plan, the orientation of the main axes, the basic organization of public and private space, all of this owes something to the Samnite period of development. The Samnites were also responsible for some of Pompeii's earliest monumental architecture. The Doric temple in the triangular forum, one of the oldest surviving structures in the city, dates to this period. The early phases of the forum itself, the open civic space that would remain the heart of Pompeii for centuries, were laid out under Samnite influence. The town was growing not just in size but in civic ambition. It was becoming a place that wanted to be seen as significant. Then came Rome. The Roman conquest of Campania was a long, contested, and sometimes brutal process. The Samnite Wars, which stretched across much of the 4th and 3rd centuries before Common Era, were among the most serious military challenges Rome faced during its expansion through Italy. Pompeii and the surrounding Campanian towns were caught between the two powers. Some towns aligned with Rome early, others resisted, and the region changed hands more than once. By the end of the 3rd century before Common Era, Rome had established firm control over Campania, and Pompeii became an ally of Rome, technically independent but bound by treaty obligations, that made real autonomy limited. The arrangement that Rome imposed on its Italian allies was a peculiar one. These communities were not Roman citizens. They could not vote in Roman elections, hold Roman magistracies, or enjoy the full legal protections of Roman citizenship, but they were expected to supply soldiers to Roman armies, pay certain levies, and defer to Roman foreign policy. For generations, this arrangement held. The Italian allies fought alongside Rome in the Great Wars against Carthage. They marched with Roman legions across Spain, Greece, and North Africa. They bled for Roman victories and received relatively little in return. The tension this created was not merely political. It was deeply personal. Wealthy Campanian landowners watched Roman aristocrats grow enormously rich from the spoils of empire, while their own legal status remained second class. Merchants in Pompeii traded in a world shaped by Roman power, but could not participate in Roman governance. By the early 1st century, before Common Era, this resentment had reached a breaking point across Italy. In 91 before Common Era, the Italian allies rose in revolt. Historians call this the Social War, from the Latin word for allies. It was one of the most serious military crises Rome had faced in generations. The rebels formed their own state, with their own capital, their own magistrates, and their own coinage. Pompeii joined the revolt. The city's walls were strengthened, its gates reinforced, and its citizens prepared to fight. Roman forces under the general Lucius Cornelius Sulla besieged Pompeii. Sling bullets with Sulla's name inscribed on them have been found embedded in the city's walls, small, hard pieces of evidence of the violence that came to the gates of this town. The war ended not with a clean Roman victory, but with a political compromise. Rome extended citizenship to most of the Italian allies, which undercut the rebellion's main cause. Pompeii received Roman citizenship, but at a cost. In 89 before Common Era, Sulla established a Roman colony in the city, settling his veterans there and installing a new Latin-speaking elite over the existing Oscan-speaking population. The old Oscan families did not simply disappear, but power shifted. The official language became Latin. Roman legal and political institutions replaced Oscan ones. The forum was rebuilt in a more thoroughly Roman style. Pompeii was, in a real sense, remade. This colonial transformation accelerated the city's integration into the Roman world. New public buildings rose in the forum area. The basilica, a large roofed hall used for legal and commercial business, was expanded. Temples were rebuilt or newly dedicated to Roman gods, alongside older Italic ones. The amphitheater, one of the oldest surviving permanent stone amphitheaters in the Roman world, was built around 80 before Common Era, a gift from the new colonial elite to their community, and a powerful statement about Pompeii's Roman identity. The population of Pompeii in the 1st century before Common Era was a complex mixture. There were descendants of the old Oscan families, Roman colonists and their descendants, freed slaves who had become citizens, immigrants from across the Mediterranean, including Greeks, Syrians, Egyptians, and Jews. The city's commercial life drew people in constantly. The harbour district was full of sailors, merchants, and workers from dozens of different backgrounds. Pompeii was, in the language of its time, a thoroughly cosmopolitan place. The economy was built on several interlocking foundations. Agriculture in the surrounding territory produced grain, wine, and olive oil in quantities that went well beyond local consumption. Pompeian wine, in particular, was exported widely. The production of a pungent fermented fish sauce called garum was a major industry, and some of the largest garum producers in the region operated out of Pompeii. Textile production, including the processing and dyeing of wool, was another significant industry. The city's location made it a natural commercial hub, and its streets were lined with shops, workshops, taverns, and bakeries, serving a population that historians estimate at somewhere between 11,000 and 20,000 people at its height, though the exact figure remains debated. The physical city that visitors encounter today, the one that tourists walk through in the 21st century, is largely the product of the last century and a half of Pompeii's life. The Forum was rebuilt and expanded under Augustus and his successors. New temples, a market building, and administrative offices gave the civic centre a monumental grandeur that signalled Pompeii's participation in the wider Roman imperial project. The streets were paved with large stone slabs. Raised stepping stones allowed pedestrians to cross without stepping in the mud and waste that accumulated in the roadway. Public fountains, fed by an aqueduct system, brought fresh water to street corners across the city. Private houses ranged from modest single-room dwellings to grand aristocratic mansions with multiple reception rooms, gardens, fountains, and elaborate wall paintings. The House of the Faun, named for a small bronze dancing figure found at its entrance, covered an entire city block and contained some of the most spectacular mosaic floors ever created in the ancient world. The Alexander mosaic, depicting the battle between Alexander the Great and the Persian king Darius III, was found here. It is one of the largest and finest examples of ancient mosaic art known to exist, and it speaks to the extraordinary wealth and cultural ambition of Pompeii's elite. Wall painting was everywhere in Pompeii, not just in the grandest houses but in modest homes, taverns, workshops, and public buildings. The paintings ranged from simple decorative patterns to elaborate architectural illusions that made walls seem to open onto imaginary landscapes. Mythological scenes, erotic imagery, still-life compositions, and portraits of the homeowners themselves covered surfaces throughout the city. This was a culture that surrounded itself with images, that used art as a language of status, pleasure, and identity. The city's street life was equally vivid. More than 2,000 electoral inscriptions have been found on Pompeii's walls, painted slogans endorsing candidates for local magistracies. These were not put up by political parties in any modern sense. They were painted by supporters, neighbours, tradespeople, and professional groups, each endorsement a small piece of social negotiation. The muleteers ask you to elect so-and-so as aedile. The fruit sellers support this man for duumvir. The city had a political culture that was participatory, local, and deeply embedded in everyday social relationships. There were also darker currents. Gladiatorial combat was enormously popular, and the amphitheater drew crowds from across the region. In 59 Common Era, a brawl between Pompeian spectators and visitors from the neighboring town of Nuceria turned into a full-scale riot. People were killed. The Roman Senate investigated and banned gladiatorial games in Pompeii for 10 years. The incident is recorded by the historian Tacitus and is illustrated in a famous wall painting found in the city. It is a reminder that civic life in Pompeii was not always orderly, and that the city's relationship with its neighbours and with Roman authority could be tense. The decade following the riot was also marked by a catastrophe of a different kind. On the 5th of February, in 62 Common Era, a major earthquake struck the region. The damage to Pompeii was severe. Temples, public buildings, private houses, and water infrastructure were all affected. The Forum was badly damaged. The Temple of Jupiter, which dominated the northern end of the Forum, was left in ruins. The earthquake was not a single event, but the beginning of a period of seismic unrest that would continue for years. The city's response to the earthquake is one of the most revealing aspects of its later history. Rather than simply repairing what had been damaged, Pompeii's wealthier residents and civic institutions undertook ambitious rebuilding programs. Buildings were redesigned and expanded. The city that would be buried by Vesuvius in 79 Common Era was in many ways still under construction. Scaffolding stood against walls, lime mortar sat in mixing vessels, marble slabs waited to be fitted into place. The earthquake had disrupted Pompeii, but it had not broken it. The city was in the process of reinventing itself when the volcano intervened. The earthquakes that struck in the years between 62 and 79 Common Era were not understood by the people of Pompeii as warning signs of volcanic activity. The Romans had no concept of Vesuvius as an active volcano. The mountain loomed over the bay, green and fertile on its slopes, and had been quiet for so long that its volcanic nature was not part of everyday consciousness. The elder Pliny, writing before the eruption, described Vesuvius as a mountain with a summit that had clearly been on fire in the past but was now dormant. The earthquakes were interpreted through the available frameworks: divine displeasure, natural tremors of the earth, omens requiring religious response, not as the grinding of magma beneath the surface. This misreading of the evidence is not a mark of Roman stupidity. It is a mark of how human beings everywhere and in every era interpret unfamiliar events through the frameworks available. The people of Pompeii had no seismological tradition, no volcanic history within living memory, and no reason to connect the shaking ground with the mountain above them. They rebuilt, they replanned, they continued their lives. And then, in the late summer of 79 Common Era, everything changed. The date of the eruption has itself been a subject of historical debate. For centuries, scholars worked from a manuscript tradition of a letter by Pliny the Younger, the nephew of the elder Pliny, who witnessed the eruption from across the bay. The letter gave the date as the 9th of the calends of September, which was interpreted as the 24th of August in the Roman calendar. But excavations in the 1980s and more recent work have produced evidence that complicates this. Food remains found in the city include pomegranates and walnuts, which ripen in autumn, not summer. A charcoal inscription found in a house during excavations announced, in a way that suggests it was written close to the time of the eruption, a date that corresponds to mid-October. Most researchers now favor a date in late October of 79 Common Era for the eruption, though the August date remains in some sources, and the question is not fully resolved. Whatever the precise date, the sequence of events is reconstructed in remarkable detail from Pliny the Younger's letters, from geological analysis of the volcanic deposits, and from the physical evidence within the city itself. The eruption began in the early afternoon. The first sign most people in Pompeii would have noticed was probably a loud noise, described by Pliny as a thunderclap, followed by the appearance above Vesuvius of a massive column of ash and gas rising into the sky. Pliny the Younger, watching from Misenum across the bay, compared it to a pine tree, the column rising high before spreading out in a canopy shape. Geologists today call this kind of eruption a Plinian eruption, named after Pliny himself. The column was enormous. It rose approximately 30 kilometers into the atmosphere. It was carrying pumice, rock fragments and ash at extraordinary velocity. For several hours, the eruption was primarily this: a column of material blasting upward and then falling downward under gravity. Pompeii, lying to the southeast of Vesuvius, was directly in the path of the fallout. Pumice stones began to rain down on the city. They were not immediately lethal. They were light, porous, and fell at a speed that was uncomfortable and damaging but survivable if you had shelter. This is the critical point that changes how we understand the human story of the eruption. For many hours, Pompeii was not instantly destroyed. The pumice fall was dangerous and terrifying, but it was survivable. People had time to make decisions. Many of them made the right decision. They left. The roads out of Pompeii were used by thousands of people who walked, ran, or rode away from the city during those first hours. The majority of Pompeii's population probably escaped. Estimates vary, but researchers believe that somewhere between 2,000 and 2,200 bodies have been found in and around the city, out of a population that may have been 11,000 to 20,000. The numbers suggest that most people got out. Those who stayed did so for various reasons. Some were waiting for the Pumice fall to stop, believing it would end. Some were trying to protect their property or their valuables. Some were physically unable to move. Some were slaves who could not leave without permission. Some were simply uncertain, paralyzed by the scale of what was happening and the impossibility of knowing what would come next. The elder Pliny himself crossed the bay toward Pompeii, not to flee but to investigate and to help. He was the commander of the Roman fleet at Misenum, a man of enormous intellectual curiosity and considerable personal courage. He took ships toward the eruption, received word that people on the shore needed rescue, and pushed on despite the worsening conditions. He reached the shore near Stabiae, south of Pompeii, spent the night with a friend named Pomponianus, and the next morning attempted to reach the beach to escape by sea. He died there. The exact cause is debated. Pliny the Younger, who was not present, reported that his uncle collapsed and died, possibly from a heart attack or from the effects of the toxic gases that accompanied the eruption. He was 56 years old. The pumice fall continued through the afternoon and into the night. Roofs began to collapse under the weight of accumulated material. Anyone still inside a building when a roof gave way faced crushing. The streets filled with pumice to a depth of several meters. Moving through the city became increasingly difficult. And then, in the early hours of the morning, the character of the eruption changed. The column that had been sustaining itself by the force of the eruption began to collapse. When a Plinian column collapses, the result is a pyroclastic surge, a fast-moving wave of superheated gas, ash, and rock fragments that rolls outward from the volcano at speeds that can exceed several hundred kilometers per hour. The temperature within a pyroclastic surge can reach several hundred degrees. Nothing in its path survives. The first surges from Vesuvius reached Herculaneum, the town to the west of the volcano, before they reached Pompeii. Herculaneum had been less affected by the pumice fall due to its position, and many of its residents had also evacuated. But hundreds had taken shelter in the boathouses on the waterfront, waiting for a chance to escape by sea. The pyroclastic surge killed them almost instantly. Their remains, discovered in the 1980s, are among the most harrowing archaeological finds of the modern era. Pompeii received its lethal surges in a rapid sequence. The first surges damaged buildings and killed people in the streets and in partially collapsed structures. The final, most powerful surges buried the city under meters of volcanic material and killed everyone who remained. The death was almost certainly rapid. Research on the skeletal remains and the famous plaster casts of the victims suggests that many died in postures of sudden shock rather than prolonged suffering. The heat was intense enough to cause instant death in most cases. The plaster casts themselves deserve a moment of explanation because they are central to how most people encounter Pompeii and because their creation is a remarkable story of archaeological ingenuity. When the volcanic material hardened around the bodies of the victims, the organic matter inside eventually decomposed, leaving hollow spaces in the rock. In the 19th century, the Italian archaeologist Giuseppe Fiorelli realized that these hollow spaces could be filled with liquid plaster, which, when hardened, would preserve the exact shape of the body at the moment of death. The results are extraordinary and deeply affecting. A dog straining against its chain, a man shielding his face with his arm, a woman curled around what may have been a child. These are not reconstructions or interpretations. They are the physical record of the last moments of real human beings. After the eruption, the landscape above Pompeii was transformed. The city was buried under 4 to 6 meters of volcanic material. The coastline had shifted. The Sarno River had been redirected. The landmarks that had defined the region were altered or erased. Survivors who returned to the area found little to orient themselves by. Some attempted to dig down through the debris to recover valuables or bodies. Tunnels dug in antiquity have been found within the ruins, evidence that some people returned quickly and knew roughly where things had been. But the scale of the destruction made systematic recovery impossible, and over time, the location of Pompeii was simply forgotten. Not entirely, and not immediately. The Roman Emperor Titus, who had come to power just 2 months before the eruption, responded with what the sources describe as genuine concern. He visited the region twice, appointed commissioners to oversee relief efforts, and directed funds from the imperial treasury toward the survivors. Nearby towns that had been damaged were rebuilt. But Pompeii, Herculaneum, and the other buried sites were simply abandoned. There was no practical way to excavate them with ancient technology, and the land above them eventually became farmland, and then, over centuries, a landscape dotted with villages and towns, whose inhabitants had no idea what lay beneath their feet. The name Pompeii did not entirely disappear from memory. Ancient writers mentioned it. Maps and geographical texts noted its existence. But the precise location of the buried city faded from practical knowledge. By the medieval period, the area was known by a different name, Civita, meaning something like the old town or the city, a ghostly echo of the fact that people sensed something significant lay there, even if they could not say what. The rediscovery of Pompeii was not a single dramatic moment. It was a gradual process that unfolded over several centuries and was shaped as much by politics and money as by intellectual curiosity. The first significant encounter came in 1599, when an engineer named Domenico Fontana was directing the construction of a canal to divert the Sarno River. His workers cut through the buried city and encountered walls, frescoes, and inscriptions. Fontana noted the finds, but did not investigate further. The project moved on. The ruins were covered again. It was not until 1748 that systematic excavation of Pompeii began, under the sponsorship of the Bourbon king Charles III of Naples and Sicily. Herculaneum had actually been rediscovered slightly earlier, in 1709, and the first excavations there had already produced spectacular finds, including bronze and marble statues that were sent to the royal palace. When Pompeii was opened, the scale of what was there quickly became apparent. Unlike Herculaneum, which was buried under hardened volcanic rock and required tunneling to access, Pompeii's looser volcanic deposits could be removed more easily. The city began to emerge. The early excavations were conducted in ways that would horrify modern researchers. Objects were removed without systematic recording of their context. Finds were taken to the royal collection at Portici. Walls were stripped of their paintings, which were cut out and transported. The focus was on finding beautiful and valuable objects, not on understanding the city as a whole. This was not unusual for the period. The concept of archaeological context, the idea that where something is found is as important as what it is, had not yet developed. The excavations at Pompeii became a sensation across Europe. The Enlightenment was in full swing, and educated Europeans were fascinated by the ancient world. Here was something unprecedented. Not ruins, not fragments, not texts, but an entire city, preserved with a completeness that no other ancient site could match. Johann Wolfgang von Goethe visited in 1787 and described the experience as one of the most extraordinary of his life. He wrote that of all the disasters that had ever befallen the world, few had given so much pleasure to posterity. The comment is uncomfortable, but it captures something real about how Pompeii was received, as a gift, as a spectacle, as a window into a world that had seemed irretrievably lost. The painter Johann Heinrich Wilhelm Tischbein, who accompanied Goethe, made drawings of the ruins. The architect Robert Adam had visited earlier and incorporated elements of Pompeian decoration into his influential neoclassical style. The Pompeian aesthetic, with its delicate painted borders, its mythological figures, its elegant interiors in country houses in England, salons in France, and parlors in the United States, all showed the influence of a buried Roman town that had been invisible for 17 centuries. The 19th century brought more systematic excavation and a growing understanding of what Pompeii actually was. Giuseppe Fiorelli, who became director of the excavations in 1860, transformed the approach. He introduced the system of dividing the city into regions and blocks for systematic recording. He insisted on excavating entire areas rather than cherry-picking objects. He published detailed reports. Fiorelli understood that Pompeii was not just a source of beautiful objects, it was a source of historical knowledge, and that knowledge could only be recovered through careful, methodical work. The later 19th and early 20th centuries saw the excavation of large portions of the city, including many of its most famous houses and public buildings. The House of the Vetii, with its extraordinary painted walls, was excavated and restored. The Villa of the Mysteries, outside the city walls, yielded one of the most debated and beautiful fresco cycles in the ancient world, a sequence of large-scale paintings whose exact meaning, whether it depicts an initiation ritual, a mythological narrative, or something else entirely, remains a subject of scholarly discussion. The 20th century brought new challenges and new methods. The Second World War caused significant damage to Pompeii. Allied bombing raids in 1943 struck the site, destroying or damaging several structures and killing a number of people in the surrounding area. After the war, restoration and further excavation continued, but resources were often inadequate for the scale of the task. The site was enormous, covering roughly 66 hectares, and maintaining it, while continuing to excavate new areas and manage increasing numbers of visitors, proved extremely difficult. By the late 20th century, Pompeii was facing a slow-motion crisis. Buildings that had survived for nearly 2,000 years underground were deteriorating rapidly after being exposed to air, rain, tourists, and inadequate conservation. Frescoes faded, walls crumbled, roofs that had been rebuilt in the 19th and 20th centuries leaked or collapsed. A report in 2009 described the site as being in a state of serious neglect. In 2010, the House of the Gladiators, a large training facility, partially collapsed after heavy rain. The incident attracted international attention and prompted significant criticism of the Italian government's management of the site. The response was a major European Union-funded restoration program called the Great Pompeii Project, which began in 2012 and injected substantial resources into conservation, drainage, and structural repair across the site. The project also supported new excavation in previously unexcavated areas, using modern techniques including ground-penetrating radar, three-dimensional scanning, and refined analysis of organic remains. The results have been remarkable. The Regio 5 excavations, which began in 2017 and continued into the early 2020s, opened up a previously unexcavated neighborhood in the northern part of the city. The finds have been extraordinary. A snack bar, called a thermopolium in Latin, was found with its serving counter intact, its painted menu still visible, and traces of the actual food that had been in its containers at the time of the eruption. Bone fragments, seeds, and residues identified by chemical analysis revealed what people in Pompeii were actually eating: duck, pig, goat, fish, snails, and various grains and legumes. It is the closest thing to a photograph of a Roman lunch counter that the ancient world has ever produced. A ceremonial chariot was found in a villa just outside the city walls, its wooden and bronze fittings preserved in extraordinary detail. It is unlike anything found before at Pompeii and suggests a level of wealth and ceremony in the suburban villas that researchers had not fully appreciated. A room that appears to have been used by enslaved workers was found nearby, its simple wooden beds, ceramic vessels, and modest personal objects preserved under the ash. The contrast between the ceremonial splendor of the chariot and the cramped simplicity of the enslaved workers' room is one of those moments when archaeology makes the past feel uncomfortably immediate. Inscriptions found in recent years have also contributed to the ongoing debate about the date of the eruption. A charcoal inscription found in October of 2018 in a house being excavated in Regio 5 appears to record a date in mid-October, which aligns with the theory that the eruption occurred in autumn rather than late summer. The inscription is in charcoal, which would not have lasted long, suggesting it was written very close to the time of the eruption. It is not definitive proof, but it adds significantly to the case for an autumn date. The story of Pompeii's legacy is also, inevitably, a story of how different eras have used the city for their own purposes. The Bourbon monarchs of Naples used the excavations to enhance their prestige and fill their royal collections. Enlightenment thinkers used Pompeii as evidence of the superiority of classical civilization. And the German art historian Johann Joachim Winckelmann, who is often called the father of art history, drew heavily on the finds from Herculaneum and Pompeii in developing his influential theories about ancient Greek and Roman art. He never actually visited the sites himself, which is a detail that says something about how ideas travel faster than people. The 19th century turned Pompeii into a setting for popular fiction and drama. Edward Bulwer Lytton's novel The Last Days of Pompeii, published in 1834, was an enormous bestseller that shaped how millions of people imagined the city. The novel is not historical scholarship. It is romantic melodrama set against a spectacular backdrop, but it created a vivid popular image of Pompeii that persisted for generations and, in some ways, still shapes how casual visitors approach the site. The 20th century added new layers of interpretation. Feminist scholars drew attention to the evidence for women's lives in Pompeii, the priestesses who held significant public roles, the businesswomen who ran their own enterprises, the evidence for female literacy and artistic patronage. Scholars of slavery examined the evidence for the lives of enslaved people, who made up a substantial portion of Pompeii's population and whose labor underpinned almost every aspect of the city's prosperity. The graffiti of Pompeii, more than 11,000 individual inscriptions ranging from electoral endorsements to declarations of love to obscene jokes, has been studied as a record of voices that formal historical sources rarely preserve. The sexuality of Pompeii has attracted particular attention, sometimes thoughtful and sometimes sensationalist. The city's erotic wall paintings and sculptures, many of which were collected in the early 19th century, into a special room at the National Museum in Naples that was accessible only to men of good standing, then later to women of good standing, then eventually to the general public, have been interpreted in many different ways. Some scholars see them as evidence of a Roman attitude towards sexuality that was more open and less moralized than later Christian Europe. Others caution against reading modern categories of sexuality back onto a world that organized these things very differently. The debate continues, and it is genuinely complex. What is not complex is the physical reality of Pompeii's preservation. No other ancient site gives us this kind of access to the texture of daily life. We know what bread Pompeians ate because carbonized loaves have been found in bakeries, some still in the ovens. We know what their gardens looked like because the root cavities of plants have been preserved in the volcanic material and filled with plaster, just as the bodies were, allowing researchers to reconstruct the exact layout of garden beds and identify individual plant species. We know the names of hundreds of ordinary people, not just emperors and generals, because they wrote on walls, signed their names to contracts, and left their marks on the objects they used. We know that a man named Gaius Pomidius Dipylus scratched his name and the date into a wall near the Forum on the third day before the Ides of October in 78 before Common Era, which is the oldest dated graffito found in Pompeii and one of the oldest pieces of everyday Latin writing known to exist. We know that a woman named Fortunata was mourned by her husband Scintilla with an inscription that speaks of genuine grief. We know that a gladiator named Celadus was called the heartthrob of the girls by his admirers. These are not abstractions. These are people. This is what makes Pompeii unique among ancient sites, and what gives it a kind of moral weight that goes beyond its archaeological significance. Other ancient cities have left us monuments, texts, and philosophical systems. Pompeii left us the people themselves, or at least the shape of them, the hollow spaces where they were. The plaster casts are not beautiful. They are not heroic. They are simply human, caught in the middle of ordinary life and extraordinary death, and they resist the kind of abstract idealization that often distances us from the ancient world. The deeper question that Pompeii raises, the one that has occupied thinkers since the 18th century, is not simply what happened there, it is what it means that it happened. Pompeii was not a great capital. It was not the seat of an empire or the birthplace of a religion. It was a medium-sized commercial town in a prosperous region, full of ordinary ambitions, ordinary pleasures, and ordinary conflicts. Its people were neither better nor worse than people anywhere else. They kept slaves, they enjoyed blood sports, they painted obscene jokes on their walls, and they also loved their children, tended their gardens, ran their businesses with care, and voted in local elections with genuine civic engagement. The volcano did not discriminate. It buried the grand houses and the cramped workshops alike. It preserved the temple and the tavern with equal indifference. It killed the wealthy and the enslaved in the same surge of superheated gas, and in doing so, it created something that no human effort could have deliberately produced. A complete cross-section of a Roman town, a record of life as it actually was, rather than as it was meant to be remembered. Every civilization produces monuments intended to last, temples, palaces, tombs, inscriptions proclaiming the greatness of rulers and the favor of gods. Pompeii's preservation is the opposite of that. It was not preserved because anyone wanted it to be. It was preserved by catastrophe, by the same force that destroyed it. The bread in the oven, the election slogans on the wall, the half-finished mosaic on the floor, the personal seal ring dropped by someone who never came back for it. None of these were meant to be monuments. They survived because they were simply there when the mountain spoke. There is something in that which speaks to the limits of human planning and the unpredictability of what endures. The emperors who built marble forums and triumphal arches in Rome have left us impressive ruins. But we know them at a distance, through the formal language of power. Pompeii gives us something different. It gives us the unguarded moment, the city as it was on an ordinary afternoon before the sky turned dark. The ongoing excavations at Pompeii continue to produce new knowledge. The Great Pompeii Project has transformed conservation standards at the site and demonstrated that modern techniques can recover information that earlier excavations missed or destroyed. Ground-penetrating radar surveys have mapped unexcavated areas in detail before a single shovel breaks the ground. Chemical analysis of residues in ceramic vessels has identified foodstuffs, medicines, and perfumes. Isotope analysis of skeletal remains has begun to reveal where people came from, confirming the cosmopolitan character of the city's population and showing that some individuals had traveled from as far as North Africa and the Eastern Mediterranean before ending their lives in Pompeii. The site now receives approximately 3.5 million visitors each year, making it one of the most visited archaeological sites in the world. Managing that number of visitors while preserving a fragile ancient city is an ongoing challenge. New visitor routes have been designed to distribute foot traffic more evenly across the site. Digital technologies allow visitors to see reconstructions of buildings as they originally appeared. Research partnerships between Italian institutions and universities across Europe and North America have brought new expertise and resources to bear on the site's many remaining questions. Roughly 1/3 of Pompeii has never been systematically excavated. The unexcavated areas are now understood to be a resource to be preserved for future generations with better techniques, rather than opened up with current methods that might destroy information that those future researchers could recover. This is a significant shift in philosophy, from the 19th century drive to uncover everything as quickly as possible, to a more patient, more careful approach that recognizes the limits of present knowledge and the value of leaving something for the future. The legacy of Pompeii also lives in the science of volcanology. The detailed record of the eruption of 79 Common Era, preserved in Pliny the Younger's letters and in the geological layers of the deposits themselves, has been fundamental to understanding how Plinian eruptions work. The classification of eruption types, the modeling of pyroclastic surges, the study of how volcanic gases behave, all of these fields have been shaped by the evidence from Vesuvius. And Vesuvius is not dormant. It last erupted in 1944, during the Second World War, and it remains one of the most closely monitored volcanoes in the world. Approximately 3 million people live within what volcanologists consider the danger zone around the mountain. Evacuation plans exist. The lessons of 79 Common Era have not been forgotten by those whose job it is to think about what happens when the mountain speaks again. What Pompeii ultimately teaches is not a simple lesson. It does not teach that civilization is fragile, though it is. It does not teach that nature is indifferent to human ambition, though it is. It teaches something more specific and more human, that the ordinary life of ordinary people is worth preserving, worth studying, worth taking seriously. The grand narratives of history, the rise and fall of empires, the decisions of generals and emperors, the movements of armies and ideas, these are real and important, but they are not the whole story. The whole story includes the baker who left bread in his oven. The whole story includes the woman whose last act was to pull her cloak over her face. The whole story includes the child whose small bones lie next to an adult's in the volcanic debris, and whose name we will never know. Pompeii survived its destruction not because it was great in the conventional sense, but because it was real. It was a place where people lived with all the complexity and contradiction and ordinary dailiness that human life involves. The volcano that killed it also made it immortal, not in the way that rulers and conquerors imagined immortality, through monuments and inscriptions proclaiming their greatness, but in a more honest way. Pompeii endures as evidence that the past was populated by people who were, in the end, very much like us, ambitious and fearful, generous and cruel, full of plans that the future would not honor, and unaware, on an ordinary afternoon, that the world they knew was about to end. That is the most profound thing the city has to say. Not that disaster can come without warning, though it can, not that nothing lasts, though nothing does, but that the life being lived right now, the unremarkable, unmonumental, daily life, is already history. It is already worth preserving. It is already, in its ordinariness, extraordinary. If this story moved you, or taught you something, or made you think differently about the ancient world, please leave a comment below telling us which part of Pompeii's story struck you most. Was it the people who escaped? The ones who stayed? The bread in the oven? The graffiti on the walls? We read every comment, and your thoughts genuinely shape the stories we choose to tell next. Subscribe to our channel if you have not already, and explore the rest of our history playlist for more serious, deeply researched documentaries on the ancient world and beyond. The past has more to say. We are here to listen.